Welcome back to Chairman's Corner on the Dolphin platform. I'm Juan Zarate. Welcome to 2023. I want to talk to you about some things I see happening in 2023 that are going to be important to watch thematically. Sanctions, more sanctions when it comes to Russia and perhaps other issues. The years of living dangerously in the crypto environment may be rationalized and regulated in 2023. And finally, investment security taking center stage, in particular in the competition with China. That's what we're going to focus on this episode of Chairman's Corner. So let's start with sanctions. We know that the U.S., along with the G7, put in place oil price caps through an unprecedented sanctions regime tied to the maritime industry, putting limits on what Russian oil could be transported where and at what price. This was a really innovative program put in place to do two things. One, to allow Russian oil to flow, but to try to find ways to constrict Russian revenue into the coffers of the Kremlin as they continue their aggressive and unprecedented war in Ukraine. We'll see how this plays out. I was fortunate enough to interview Andrea Gacki, the OFAC director, in early December at a conference where she said that playing out the enforcement will be a critical priority for OFAC. So we'll see how that plays out. I think what's interesting here is we're going to see continued enforcement around the Russia sanctions program, a focus on evasion. We already know that the Russians are establishing a secret fleet of oil tankers to move their oil in evasion of existing controls and sanctions. And we also know from Andrea Gacki and our own analysis that OFAC will continue to look at the overlap of sanctions programs, especially as Russia depends more and more on Iran, on North Korea, and other sanctioned states for weaponry and even finance. And so you're going to see continued implementation of blended sanctions programs in the context of Russia. What's clear here is you've got no dearth of sanctions. You certainly have the Europeans willing to impose sanctions. We've talked about this before on Chairman's Corner. So something to watch is clearly the schisms that emerge in the sanctions regime. Which countries are willing to implement what sanctions? How aggressive is enforcement? And are there issues that arise moving forward, whether in the energy domain or the export domain that begin to create fissures in the transatlantic alliance? Those are things to watch. But there's going to be a complete desire and appetite to use sanctions against Russia and against those that are aligned with Russia to try to constrain revenue to the Kremlin. So let's watch that in 2023. What's next? Crypto. We know that the collapse of FTX, the scandal that surrounded the most serious crypto scandal in recent memory, is driving the quest and the desire for more regulation. It's actually opened the aperture with respect to regulation, with many regulators now saying they want to ban certain parts of the crypto economy. India talking about this, Singapore and others. The very fact that you've had a series of scandals, Terra Luna, FTX and others, has opened the aperture. And frankly, the skepticism that was brewing out there around whether or not crypto could really be trusted and whether or not it should be considered legitimate. The reality is we are going through a crypto blizzard. You're going to see a lot of actors, weak actors, fall by the wayside. Untrustworthy stable coins and other coins sort of fall by the wayside as well. Only the strong will survive, but the technology will survive. And I think this is evidenced by a lot of the projects and programs that were announced even late last year in 2022, including from the Bank of New York and the Fed. Questions about the digital dollar in the United States, the continued progress towards central bank digital currencies, and frankly, the utility of underlying technologies like blockchain to facilitate things like smart contract and other things. So Ethereum, Bitcoin, other things will still be relevant and of use. And so what you're going to see ultimately is a debate around how hard to regulate and how hard to enforce in the crypto domain, not whether or not to regulate, which was often the discussion before, or whether or not to fully make illegal, which I think will become more and more of a fringe regulatory argument. But that said, crypto is going to be front and center for every regulator around the world, and that will be something to watch carefully in 2023. Last but certainly not least is the competition between the US and China, and the competition playing out not just in the sanctions domain, but in the context of investment security. What do I mean by this? We've talked often about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, the expansion of those authorities under FIRMA, congressionally passed legislation that expanded the definition of what is considered to be national security, national economic security, and a desire by the U.S. to impose more scrutiny over inbound investment into critical sectors and technologies, all with a concern that the Chinese government, the Russian government, nefarious actors may be getting access to sensitive IP, may be influencing in the U.S., and we've certainly seen this debate as we've talked about whether or not TikTok will be allowed to operate in the United States and if they're going to be subject to a national security agreement under CFIUS. The interesting thing here is there's going to be continued debate around what investment security means in the United States, including things like what does TikTok operating in the U.S. potentially look like. States are continuing to look carefully at how to regulate investment into state economies, including in the agricultural sectors. And finally, Congress and the administration here in Washington are looking at regimes for outbound investment controls. That is to say, not just worried about what investments coming into the U.S. from abroad, but what American capital is going out to finance things that the Chinese may find attractive from a technological perspective or from a national security perspective. That will be at the heart of the debate in 2023. How aggressive should investment security be viewed, not just on the inbound side, but on the outbound side? So let's watch that domain as part of our national economic security prism. Well, that's it for Chairman's Corner. Hope you found that helpful. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. The years of living dangerously in crypto may be over, or at least regulated. And finally, investment security is taking pride of place in the competition between the U.S. and China. Hope you enjoyed this session of Chairman's Corner. We're going to be back to you soon on the Dolphin platform. But that's it for this session. Have a great year.